Missing teen rescued from horrific kidnapping and sex trafficking nightmare. Shocking details revealed. Hook. What happens when you think you've escaped, only to realize you're still trapped? Watch as every decision leads to a chilling twist you won't see coming. The fight for survival has just begun. The moon hung low, casting pale light over the darkened streets. A quiet chill clung to the air, creeping through the cracks of the old house. Inside, everything felt still, too still. The faintest sound echoed footsteps. Soft, shuffling, her heart hammered. She strained to hear, but the silence returned, thick and suffocating. Her eyes darted around the dimly lit room. The walls seemed to close in on her. The musty smell of old furniture and decay mixed with something unfamiliar. Fear swelled in her chest. She didn't remember how she got here, or how long she had been trapped. The last thing she recalled was walking home from school, the sun setting behind her. Then nothing. The door creaked open slowly. A shadow appeared in the doorway. It lingered there, watching her. Her body froze, heart pounding so loud she thought it might break free from her ribs. The shadow stepped forward. She could make out the faint outline of a man, tall, looming. His presence filled the room like a dark cloud. He said nothing. His eyes, cold and empty, met hers. She tried to move, but her limbs felt heavy, paralyzed. The air was thick with the scent of sweat and something sharper, metallic. Her breathing quickened. She wasn't alone anymore. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to scream, to fight. But she couldn't. The man stepped closer. A door slammed somewhere far off. Her pulse shot up, but it didn't matter. The room felt like a cage. She wanted to scream, wanted to beg, but she didn't trust her voice. Would it make a difference? Was anyone listening? A low murmur broke the silence. "Don't worry," the man whispered. "You'll be just fine." But his words felt like a promise she couldn't escape. Every nerve in her body screamed in warning. Something terrible was coming, and she had no way to stop it. The man's shadow stretched across the floor, dark and twisted. He moved closer, his breath cold against her skin. Her body tensed, every muscle screaming for escape. But her legs were frozen, her throat dry and tight. The air around her felt heavier, thick with dread. He smiled, a twisted curve of his lips. It wasn't a smile of comfort. It was a smile of control. His hand reached out, brushing a lock of hair from her face. His touch was cold, like ice. She flinched, but couldn't pull away. The room seemed to shrink around her. The walls, the ceiling, everything felt like it was closing in. Suddenly, the sound of a car engine in the distance. Her heart leaped in her chest. Could someone hear? Could they help her? She strained to hear more, but the engine faded, replaced by the echo of her own panicked breathing. The man watched her closely, as if sensing her fleeting hope. "Don't waste your time," he muttered, voice low and dangerous. "You're not getting out." The cold terror that gripped her heart squeezed tighter. She tried to speak, but her voice cracked, raw and weak. "Please, please." But the man didn't seem to hear her, or didn't care. With a harsh motion, he grabbed her arm. His fingers dug in deep. She gasped, the pain shooting through her. Her skin burned where his grip tightened. The room spun, and she stumbled backward, desperate to stay on her feet. Her mind raced, searching for any way to escape. Anything. But the door was shut. The windows sealed tight. She was trapped. The sound of footsteps outside. Closer now. Her pulse quickened. Someone was coming. But would they be too late? The door handle rattled. Her breath caught. Hope flickered, then died. The footsteps stopped. She was alone again. Or so it seemed. But the man had never left. He was still there, waiting, watching. And the terror inside her grew, With every passing second, the man's eyes never left hers. Every second stretched longer, a suffocating silence wrapping around them. Her breath came in shallow gasps, struggling to fill her lungs. Her body was weak, trembling from the fear, from the pain. She couldn't stop shaking. The room felt colder now, despite the warmth of the night outside. Then, suddenly, the door creaked open again. Her heart skipped a beat, hope rising and crashing in a single moment. A figure stepped inside. A woman, tall, dark-haired. Her expression was unreadable, hard. She didn't speak. Her eyes scanned the room, but they didn't linger on the girl. She was focused on the man. "Is she ready?" the woman asked, her voice cold and distant. The man didn't answer immediately. His gaze shifted, but only for a moment. "Not yet," he said, his voice dark and low. The woman nodded once, slowly, her eyes flicking back to the girl. Something in her gaze was calculating, distant, almost cruel. The girl's blood ran cold. Was this woman part of the nightmare too? Was anyone here a stranger? The man stepped back, his grip loosening just enough for the girl to pull her arm away. She wanted to run, wanted to scream, but there was nowhere to go. The woman moved closer now, stopping just a few feet away. Her eyes narrowed, studying her. "You don't belong here," the woman whispered. It wasn't a question, but a statement. The girl's mouth went dry. "Please let me go," she pleaded, the words barely leaving her lips. The woman only smiled, a chilling, hollow thing. "It doesn't work that way," she said softly. The man turned, heading toward the corner of the room, his back to them. The woman remained where she was, and the girl could feel it, the moment of decision, of choice. Was this the moment she would break? Would this be the point where it ended? Or would this nightmare drag her deeper, where there would be no return? Every breath felt like an eternity. The walls were closing in again, and there was nowhere left to hide. The silence between them stretched, unbearable. The woman's eyes were still fixed on her, calculating. The man's footsteps echoed as he moved around the room, his presence like a shadow in the corner of her vision. The girl's body felt numb, frozen. She could barely feel her hands anymore, clenched so tightly into fists. Was this it? Was this the end? A soft sound, whispers barely audible, came from the shadows. She couldn't make out the words, but they were there, like a breeze brushing over her skin. The woman took a step forward, the floor creaking under her weight. "I'm not going to hurt you," she said. The girl's pulse raced. What kind of twisted comfort was that? Her instinct screamed. She should run. She should scream. But there was nowhere to go. No one to hear. The woman's smile remained cold and unfeeling. Her eyes never wavered. "You're not like the others," she said, her tone almost curious. Others? Who else had been here? The thought sent a chill through her, deeper than before. The man turned his back to them, but his presence was always there, looming. A part of the girl wanted to ask, wanted to beg for answers, but fear held her tongue. The woman stepped closer, her shoes tapping softly on the floor. Her eyes were cold, but there was something else, something deeper, hidden behind the mask of indifference. For a moment, she looked almost sorry. Almost. The man moved then, suddenly, breaking the fragile silence. He crossed the room with long strides, his hand moving towards a door in the far corner. The girl's heart leapt. Could this be her chance? But before she could move, before she could even think, the woman's hand shot out, gripping her wrist with terrifying strength. "Don't even think about it," she hissed. The girl's pulse thudded in her ears, the pressure of the woman's grip like iron. Her whole body was screaming, fight, run, do anything. But the woman's gaze was unyielding. She couldn't break free. Her eyes darted to the door the man had reached. Had he unlocked it? Her heart pounded in her chest. The fear wasn't just from the unknown anymore. It was from knowing that escape might never come. The room felt like a trap, no way out, no way forward. Just darkness. Closing in, the woman's grip tightened, her fingers digging into the girl's wrist like a vice. Every breath felt like a struggle. The door the man had approached, it was still open. A sliver of hope flickered, but it was swallowed whole by the weight of fear that pressed down on her chest. The man was at the door now, standing motionless. His face, partially shadowed, was unreadable. She wanted to scream, to shout, to make a sound that could break this oppressive silence. But her voice failed her, trapped inside, buried beneath the suffocating terror. The woman leaned in close, her breath hot against the girl's ear. "You think you're the first," she whispered, her voice a low hiss. "You're not. And you won't be the last." The words sent a jolt through her, something dark and horrible twisting in her gut. Her mind screamed for answers, but her body was paralyzed. The woman's smile grew, sharp and knowing. "None of you ever get out," she murmured. The man turned then, his back to the girl and the woman, and for a brief moment she could see the cold glint in his eyes. Her heart sank. The door clicked shut behind him. The girl's world seemed to crumble in that instant. She was alone again, alone with the woman, alone in this place. Her chest tightened, and the taste of fear filled her mouth. The woman's face was unreadable, almost blank, as she stepped back, releasing her grip. For a moment, everything was still, the air thick with tension. "You're scared," the woman said, almost like an observation. "Good. You should be." Her voice was softer now, but the threat was unmistakable. The girl tried to focus, tried to gather whatever strength she had left, but it was hard, harder than it had ever been. Every step she thought she might take felt like wading through mud. Escape felt impossible. The woman's eyes never wavered, watching her every move. The girl's mind raced. She was slipping away, sinking deeper into this nightmare. Could she fight? Could she somehow break free? The woman was moving again, her footsteps silent on the floor. Closer, closer. And then, in one swift motion, she was right in front of her. Her eyes, cold and empty, held her captive. "Do you understand now?" the woman asked, her voice eerily calm. The girl didn't answer. She couldn't. Not with the fear choking her. Not with the darkness pressing in. The woman's gaze bored into her, unwavering. Her face was too close now, too close for comfort. Every breath the girl took felt too shallow, too weak. "Do you understand?" the woman repeated, her tone softer but more menacing. The girl's heart hammered in her chest, each beat louder than the last. She wanted to scream. She wanted to run, but she couldn't. The walls seemed to close in even more, suffocating her. The woman's lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't warm. It wasn't comforting. It was a smile of something darker, something twisted. The girl backed up, her feet stumbling over the floor, desperate to put distance between them. But there was nowhere to go. "You're just another one," the woman said, almost as if to herself. Her words sank deep into the girl's mind, their meaning gnawing at her thoughts. Another one? Was there more? Her mind raced. The thought of others, lost like her, trapped in this nightmare, filled her with a cold dread. The woman's hand reached out, her fingers brushing the girl's cheek. A soft, almost affectionate gesture that made the girl shiver. "You'll learn," she whispered. "You'll learn what it means to be one of us." The words hit like a blow, leaving her reeling. One of us. The girl could barely process the meaning, her mind a blur of fear and confusion. Was this place some kind of trap? A system? A cycle? A sickening realization began to settle in. Was she never meant to escape? Would she be just another lost soul in this dark place? Her throat tightened. Her hands shook uncontrollably. The woman stepped back, watching her, as if savoring the fear that rolled off her in waves. The man was nowhere in sight now, but she knew he was still out there, still part of this nightmare. The girl couldn't stay here. She couldn't be part of whatever this was. She had to do something. She had to fight. But as she looked around, the walls seemed to close in tighter, the door to freedom just out of reach. Her options were slipping away. Every breath was a struggle. Every moment felt like it was slipping through her fingers. She had to act fast. Before it was too late, her mind screamed for a way out, but everything around her was a blur of shadows and fear. The woman's eyes never left her, cold and calculating, as if she was watching every thought pass through her head. The girl's fingers twitched, desperate for any sign of hope, anything to break the suffocating grip of the room. Her gaze darted around again, toward the door, toward the window. Nothing. There was nothing. Her body felt heavy, exhausted, like the terror was draining the life from her. And yet, there had to be something. There had to be a way out. Please, she whispered, barely more than a breath. But the woman didn't respond. Instead, she took another step forward, her presence suffocating. "You really think you can escape?" she asked, her voice a soft mockery of the girl's desperation. The girl's hands were shaking now, but she clenched them into fists, determined not to break. The woman's smile widened, her face darkening with something almost amused. "You're not the first to try," she said, her voice almost sing-song. "And you won't be the last." The girl's pulse raced, fear threatening to consume her. She was being toyed with. A part of her knew it, but she refused to give in. She had to survive. She had to find a way. As the woman's footsteps grew closer, the girl's eyes locked onto the edge of the room, to the shadow where she had noticed a small object earlier. A broken chair, a jagged piece of wood poking out. Her breath hitched. She could use it. She had to move quickly. Without thinking, she darted toward it, her legs trembling beneath her. But the woman was faster. In a heartbeat, she was in front of her, her hand gripping the girl's arm with unrelenting force. "Did you really think you could get away?" the woman asked, voice dripping with cold amusement. The girl's heart pounded, but she didn't stop. With a burst of strength, she twisted her arm out of the woman's grip, her fingers wrapping around the jagged piece of wood. Pain shot through her hand as the splintered wood dug into her palm, but she didn't care. She had to fight. Her breath was ragged, but she held the weapon in front of her, ready. The woman didn't flinch. Instead, her eyes gleamed with a strange, almost hungry satisfaction. "Good," she whispered, her voice low. "You're learning." And in that moment, the girl knew this was no longer about survival. This was about escaping a nightmare that never seemed to end. And she would do whatever it took to break free. The woman didn't move. Her eyes locked onto the girl with a chilling, unblinking stare. The jagged piece of wood felt like a lifeline in the girl's shaking hands, its rough surface cutting into her skin. She could feel the tremors coursing through her body, but she held on to it, held on to the last bit of defiance she had left. The woman tilted her head, watching her with a strange sort of amusement, as if the girl was nothing more than a puzzle to be solved. "Do you think that's going to save you?" she asked softly, her voice almost playful. The girl's mind raced. Her body was screaming at her to act, to strike, to run, to do anything, but her limbs felt heavier with each passing second. Her eyes darted to the door again, but she knew the woman was too close now. There was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. "You're scared," the woman said, her voice almost affectionate. "Good. You should be." Her lips parted in a smile that didn't reach her eyes. The girl gritted her teeth, trying to steady her breath, trying to find some way to make her move. The woman's smile faded. "Do you know what happens to girls like you?" she asked, her voice low and dangerous now. The word struck like a blow. Girls who think they can fight back, who think they can escape, The girl's stomach churned, the weight of her situation pressing down on her. The woman took a step closer, her gaze never leaving the girl's. "You'll end up just like all the others," she murmured, her voice almost a whisper now, sending a wave of cold fear through the girl. Broken, lost, her breath caught. The girl's fingers tightened on the wood, her knuckles white. Was this what she was meant for? No. She couldn't accept it. She couldn't let herself be another lost cause, another victim swallowed by this nightmare. The woman reached out, her hand moving toward the girl's face. The girl reacted without thinking. In one swift motion, she raised the piece of wood and swung it toward the woman. A scream tore from her throat, a raw, primal sound that echoed through the room. The woman's eyes flashed with surprise, just for a second, before the wood hit her, right across the arm. Pain flared in the girl's wrist, but the woman didn't seem to notice. The woman's hand shot out with brutal speed, grabbing the girl's wrist and twisting it painfully. She yelped, the weapon slipping from her grip. With a quick, terrifying motion, the woman slammed the girl against the wall, her breath hot against the girl's face. "Foolish girl," she whispered. "You can't fight what you don't understand." The girl gasped for air, her body shaking with the force of the impact. She was trapped. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. And yet, somewhere deep inside, a spark of resistance still burned. But how much longer could she hold on before the darkness swallowed her whole? The woman's grip tightened, her fingers digging into the girl's skin with terrifying strength. The girl's breath came in ragged gasps, her chest pressing painfully against the wall. Her heart pounded so loudly in her ears that it almost drowned out the woman's low, mocking voice. "Do you think you can win?" the woman whispered, her face inches away. "That you're strong enough to survive this?" The girl's vision blurred from the pain, but she refused to look away. The woman's words wrapped around her mind like chains, dragging her down. She couldn't let it happen. Not like this. A spark of defiance flickered in her chest. She wasn't going to die here, trapped in this nightmare. She couldn't. With every ounce of strength left, she lifted her knee and drove it upward, aiming for the woman's stomach. The woman's grip faltered for a moment, a flash of surprise crossing her face. The girl didn't wait. She shoved the woman off, stumbling backward, gasping for breath. Her vision was hazy, but she didn't care. She had to move. She darted toward the door, her legs weak, but pushing her forward. The woman recovered quickly, her eyes blazing with fury. "You think you can run?" she snarled, but the girl didn't stop. She slammed her shoulder into the door, the handle rattling as she fought against it. The door swung open. She was free. For the moment, her mind was a blur of adrenaline as she stumbled into a dimly lit hallway. She could hear the woman's voice, distant but growing closer. She was coming. The girl's legs burned, her body protesting every step, but she forced herself forward, not daring to look back. She didn't know where she was running. She didn't care. She just had to get away. She burst through another door, a burst of fresh air hitting her face. It smelled like outside. But before she could take another step, a hand shot out, grabbing her by the arm and jerking her back. The woman. Her fingers dug into the girl's skin, her grip like iron. "You're not leaving," the woman hissed. The girl's mind raced, her heart pounding so loudly it drowned out everything else. She was trapped again, but her eyes locked onto something. Anything that could help. A small table, a broken chair, anything to break free. And then she saw it, a shard of glass, a jagged piece of broken mirror lying on the floor. Her pulse quickened. She reached for it, her fingers brushing the cold, sharp edge. The woman's grip tightened, dragging her backward. But the girl was faster now. She swung the shard of glass, her arm cutting through the air. It struck the woman's arm, and a sharp cry of pain escaped her lips. The girl didn't hesitate. She pulled the glass closer, using it as a weapon. The woman staggered back, a snarl twisting her face. The girl, panting, stood her ground, the shard gripped tightly in her hand. For the first time, she could see the woman falter, and that moment, just that fleeting moment, was enough. She lunged forward, driving the shard toward the woman's chest. The woman hissed, but this time, she didn't stop it. It was all she needed. The woman staggered back, clutching her chest, her breath shallow. The girl wasted no time. She turned, sprinting down the hallway with everything she had left. The sound of footsteps behind her grew fainter. She didn't dare look back, not until she burst through another door, outside, into the night. The air was cold, biting, but it was freedom. Her chest heaved with exhaustion, her body trembling, but she was alive, and for the first time, she let herself believe it. She was free. For now, the night air felt like a bomb against her skin, but it wasn't enough to calm the storm inside her. Her heart still pounded, her breath ragged as she stumbled down the dark street, her eyes darting wildly from side to side. She couldn't stop. She couldn't slow down. The sound of her footsteps echoed around her, each one a reminder of how fragile her escape had been. Her mind raced. Where was she going? Who could she turn to? The world around her seemed unfamiliar, strange. Everything felt foreign, as though she was walking through a dream. Every shadow loomed too large. Every rustle of leaves made her jump. But she couldn't stop. The fear still clung to her, a constant weight on her shoulders. She needed help. She needed to disappear. The sound of distant sirens wove into the night, a beacon of hope, but it felt too far away. She didn't trust it, not yet. The street stretched out in front of her, endless and empty. Her legs ached, her body threatening to collapse from exhaustion, but she kept moving. She didn't know how much time had passed. Minutes? Hours? It didn't matter. She had to keep moving. The world felt too quiet, too still. She couldn't stop, not yet. Then, just ahead, a flicker of movement caught her eye. A figure. She froze, her body tensed, ready to bolt in the opposite direction. But the figure wasn't chasing her. It was someone else. Just a man, standing still under the dim light of a street lamp, his features obscured by the darkness. She couldn't breathe. Her body instinctively took a step back, her pulse quickening. Was he one of them? Had they found her already? The man didn't move, but his eyes locked onto hers. Something about his stillness unnerved her, like he was waiting for something, waiting for her to make a move. Her legs screamed in protest, but she couldn't stop herself. She turned quickly, scanning the street for a place to hide. But before she could take another step, the man spoke. "Are you okay?" His voice was calm, steady. It wasn't threatening. It wasn't cold. She hesitated, torn between the raw instinct to run and the desperate need for help. She started, but the words caught in her throat. Her mind was a blur, the events of the past hours crashing down on her, suffocating her. The man took a step forward, slowly, cautiously. "I won't hurt you," he said, his voice softer now. "I promise." The girl's heart raced in her chest, but something in his tone made her pause. He wasn't one of them. For a moment, she just stood there, trapped between fear and the desperate hope for safety. She looked into his eyes, searching for any sign of danger, any hint of deceit. But there was nothing. No malice, no threat. Her breath came out shakily. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I need help." The man's expression softened, and he stepped closer, his hand reaching out slowly. "Come with me," he said, his voice gentle. Something in her wavered. It was the first genuine offer of safety she'd heard in so long. But she couldn't ignore the fear that still gripped her. What if it was another trap? She couldn't afford to be wrong. But as he reached out to her, something in her shifted. Some flicker of trust that had been buried deep inside her. It was a risk, but it was a risk she had to take. She didn't have a choice. Her body tensed, every muscle ready to flee at the slightest hint of danger. But something about the man's eyes, his calm demeanor, softened the edges of her fear. The cold night air wrapped around them, thick with silence. He was still standing there, hand outstretched, waiting. She took a hesitant step forward, her heart in her throat. She didn't know him. She didn't know if she could trust him. But she didn't have anywhere else to go, no one else to turn to. Her fingers brushed his, just for a second. Then he gently grasped her hand, steadying her, his touch firm but reassuring. "Come on," he said softly. "You're safe now." The words, simple as they were, carried more weight than she ever could have imagined. She nodded slowly, barely able to make sense of the swirling thoughts in her mind. For the first time in what felt like forever, she let someone else guide her, even if she wasn't entirely sure where they were going. He led her down the street, his steps measured, careful. Her legs felt weak, like they might give out at any moment, but she pushed through. Every instinct told her to look over her shoulder, to check for any signs of pursuit, but the quiet around them felt almost surreal. They walked in silence for a few minutes, and the girl's mind raced with questions. Where was he taking her? Why was he helping her? The sound of distant sirens still echoed in the air, but it felt like they were moving further from whatever danger lurked behind her. Finally, the man broke the silence. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" His voice was gentle, but there was a weight to it, an understanding that made her throat tighten. The girl swallowed, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know how much longer I can keep running." His grip tightened slightly, offering a sense of comfort she hadn't felt in so long. "You don't have to run anymore," he said. "Not with me." She didn't reply right away, the weight of his words pressing down on her. Could she really stop running? Could she trust this man? But before she could say anything more, they reached a small, dimly lit building tucked away between two larger structures. A safe house. He stopped at the door, turning to her. "This is where you'll be safe. For now." She glanced at the door, at the building that seemed so ordinary, yet somehow felt like a lifeline in the chaos of the past few hours. Without saying anything more, he pushed the door open and stepped inside, holding it open for her. She hesitated for just a moment, then walked in. The room inside was modest, clean, but nothing special. It smelled faintly of antiseptic, but there was something oddly comforting about it. The man closed the door behind them, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt the pressure on her chest begin to loosen. She could breathe. The man turned to her, his expression softening as he studied her face. "Do you want to talk about it?" he asked quietly. The girl didn't know if she was ready to tell him everything, but something about his calm, steady presence made her feel like it was okay to be vulnerable. She nodded just a little. "I was taken," she started, her voice trembling but growing steadier as she went on. "I was kidnapped, trapped. They were going to sell me." Her eyes closed as she said the words, as if speaking them aloud made the weight of them somehow more real. He didn't interrupt. He just listened. "I don't even know how I got away," she whispered. "It was all so fast. I thought I was going to die." The man nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. "You're not dead," he said simply, but there was something in his voice that made the words sound like a promise. She exhaled sharply, trying to steady herself, her emotions threatening to spill over. "I don't know what to do now," she murmured, staring at the floor, feeling lost. The man took a step closer, his voice gentle. "You take it one day at a time. That's all any of us can do." She nodded, feeling the weight of exhaustion pulling at her. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small key and handing it to her. "This is your room. You can rest here." She took the key, her fingers brushing his once more. "Thank you," she said quietly, almost too quietly for him to hear. He smiled softly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You're safe here," he said again. As she walked toward the small door down the hall, her mind raced. Had she truly escaped? Could she trust that this man would keep her safe? Or was this just another part of the nightmare? But as she pushed open the door to the room, the small bed and the quietness that greeted her felt like a sliver of peace. And for the first time in a long time, she let herself believe it was real. Maybe, just maybe, she could rest. At least for tonight, the bed felt too soft, too comfortable after everything that had happened. Her body sank into it, every muscle aching from the constant tension. But sleep didn't come. Not yet. Her mind raced, replaying the events over and over. The woman's face, the dark, suffocating rooms, the jagged shard of glass in her hand, the escape. It felt like a dream, a nightmare. She pulled the thin blanket over her, trying to push the thoughts away, but they clung to her like shadows. It was hard to shake the image of the woman's smile, that twisted, knowing look. "You think you can run," she had said. It echoed in her ears, making her stomach tighten. The door to the room creaked softly, and the girl tensed, her pulse quickening. But it was only the man, standing in the doorway, his silhouette dark against the light from the hallway. "I didn't mean to disturb you," he said, his voice low. "But do you need anything? Water? Food?" She stared at him for a moment, unsure if she was ready to talk again, if she could trust her own voice. But the look in his eyes, soft, caring, made her hesitate. She nodded slowly. "Water," she managed, her voice hoarse. He stepped into the room, moving quietly, as though trying not to disturb the fragile calm that hung between them. When he returned, he handed her a small glass of water, the cool liquid offering a brief moment of comfort as she drank it. "Thank you," she whispered, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. He didn't sit down, just stood there watching her, his gaze steady, waiting. "Do you—" He trailed off, as if unsure of how to continue. "Do you want to talk about what happened? I can't help if you don't." Her chest tightened at the question. The words felt too heavy to say, too hard to let out. But somehow she nodded. I was taken," she started, her voice barely above a whisper, "by a man and a woman. They were part of something bigger. They were going to sell me." Her breath hitched, and she quickly wiped at her eyes, trying to blink back the tears. The man didn't interrupt. He just nodded, his expression softening with empathy. "I tried to get away," she continued. "I don't even know how I did it. But when I did, I didn't know where to go. I didn't know if I was still being watched, if they'd come after me, if I was safe." The man stepped closer, but not too close. He didn't invade her space, just stayed within her line of sight, offering his presence, his steady silence. "You're safe here," he said, his voice firm now, more reassuring. "I won't let anything happen to you." But she wasn't sure she could believe him entirely. There was something about him that felt different, though. He wasn't like the others. He wasn't cold. He wasn't cruel. Still, the memories of the last few hours haunted her, and the fear that she hadn't escaped yet gnawed at her insides. "You don't have to stay here if you don't want to," the man said quietly, his voice cutting through her spiraling thoughts. "But I can help you. If you trust me." Her heart skipped a beat. Trust. She had learned the hard way that trust was fragile, easy to shatter, and once broken, almost impossible to rebuild. But something in his eyes, something in the way he spoke, made her want to believe, even if just for a moment. The girl took a shaky breath, glancing down at her hands, still trembling. "I'm scared," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't know if I can do this. Keep running. Keep hiding." For a moment, the man said nothing. He just stood there, letting her words hang in the air. Then, slowly, he moved closer, gently sitting on the edge of the bed, though still giving her space. "You don't have to do it alone," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm here, and you don't need to run anymore. Not tonight." The girl looked at him, unsure if she could let down the walls she had built around herself. But in that moment, something shifted. A small, fragile flicker of hope, buried beneath the weight of everything that had happened. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she allowed herself to close her eyes, to rest, to trust, even if just for tonight. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. The darkness of the room felt almost comforting, wrapping around her like a blanket. Her mind was still racing, but exhaustion was finally creeping in, pulling her towards sleep. The bed beneath her felt more real now, less like a fragile illusion. She wanted to believe she was safe, but deep down, a part of her was still waiting for the moment when everything would shatter. Sleep tugged at her eyelids, but the questions, the doubts, wouldn't let go. Was she really safe? Could she trust this man? Was this place really a refuge or just another part of the trap? But as she shifted, trying to make herself comfortable, she noticed something. He was still there, sitting on the edge of the bed, just watching her, as though he was waiting for her to give him a sign. And that, in a strange way, made her feel grounded. He wasn't pushing her. He wasn't demanding anything. He was just there. And that was enough for now. Her breath slowed, her body finally beginning to relax, the tightness in her chest loosening with every exhale. The man didn't move, his presence a quiet reassurance in the dark. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt her body begin to drift into the fragile calm of sleep. But as she was just about to slip away, a sound broke through the silence. Faint but unmistakable. A creak. A shift in the hallway outside her room. Her eyes shot open, heart leaping into her throat. The man's head snapped up, his body instantly alert. The noise grew louder. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, approaching the door. Her breath caught in her throat. The man stood up slowly, his movements controlled, almost too calm. "Stay here," he said quietly, his voice steady but with an edge of urgency. The girl barely had time to react before he was already moving toward the door, slipping silently out into the hallway. Her heart thudded in her chest, fear flooding back in an instant. What was going on? Who else was here? Was this another part of the trap? She wanted to follow him, but her legs felt like lead. Instead, she stayed where she was, her pulse racing as she strained to hear anything from outside the door. Footsteps, the creak of the floorboards, a muffled voice. She couldn't make out the words. Her stomach twisted, anxiety gnawing at her insides. A few seconds later, the door to her room creaked open just a crack. The man was standing there again, his face tense, eyes scanning the room quickly before settling on her. "Stay quiet," he whispered. She nodded, barely able to breathe. He closed the door softly behind him and moved toward the window, glancing over his shoulder at her one last time. "Lock the door behind me," he murmured. She wanted to ask what was going on, what he was doing, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she just did as he said. The lock clicked shut, the sound sharp in the silence. Her heart pounded in her chest as she sat back down on the bed, staring at the door. The minutes stretched on, each one dragging her deeper into a pit of uncertainty. What had happened? Who was out there? Was he in danger? She tried to steady her breath, but the waiting, the uncertainty, gnawed at her. The door stayed locked. The footsteps outside had stopped. Her mind raced, thoughts darting in every direction. She needed to know what was happening. She needed to understand. She couldn't stay in the dark anymore. And yet, as she rose from the bed, every instinct screamed for her to stay put. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. She glanced at the door, her fingers hovering over the lock, torn between staying safe or finding out what was happening on the other side. What if she was wrong? What if it was all just a misunderstanding? But if there was even the slightest chance she could be in danger, she couldn't wait. Her hand gripped the door handle. Her breath caught in her throat. She turned it slowly, cautiously, and cracked the door open just a sliver. The door creaked open, the sound too loud in the stillness. Her heart was pounding again, louder than ever, as she peered through the crack. The hallway was dim, shadows stretching along the walls. She didn't see anyone, not at first. Her pulse quickened, her mind racing. Had he left? Was it safe now? Her eyes darted down the hall, but there was nothing, no sign of movement. She stood there, frozen, not knowing what to do next. Then, just as she was about to step back, a figure appeared from the shadows at the end of the hallway. It wasn't the man, a tall, broad-shouldered man in a dark jacket, his face obscured by the hood he wore. The girl's breath caught in her throat. Fear surged through her veins. Who was this? The man in the hallway was moving toward her, his footsteps silent, deliberate. She didn't know if he had seen her, but instinct screamed at her to hide, to get away. But the door was still partially open. Her hand was still gripping the handle. It was too late to close it without him noticing. Her mind raced. Her options felt limited. The man was getting closer, his heavy steps echoing in the quiet hall. The girl's eyes shot to the window. Could she escape through there? She didn't even know if it opened, but it was her only chance. She moved quickly, silently, away from the door, her heart in her throat as she reached the window. It was small, barely enough space for her to fit through, but it was her only way out. She reached for the latch and tried to pull it open, but it stuck, refusing to budge. The man was closer now, closer. She could hear his breathing, heavy and deliberate, as though he already knew she was there. Her breath hitched, and panic surged again. She yanked at the window, harder this time, her hands trembling. The sound of the latch finally gave way, and the window creaked open just enough for her to slip through. But just as she was about to climb out, a voice called out from the hallway. "Don't even think about it." It was low, calm, but there was a weight to it that made her freeze. The girl turned slowly, her heart hammering in her chest. The man in the hallway was standing there now, blocking the only way out. His eyes were cold, calculating. He wasn't alone. Behind him, two more figures emerged from the shadows, closing in. The girl's mind spun. She was trapped. She tried to push the window open further, but the space was too tight now, and the shadows were too close. She looked at the man in the hallway. His lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't kind. It was the same smile from before, the one that made her skin crawl. "You should have stayed where you were," he said, his voice almost a whisper, as the others moved forward. The girl's pulse raced as she glanced back at the door, weighing her options. She was caught, outnumbered, but she wouldn't go down without a fight. Not again. Her fingers found something, a small lamp by the bed. She grabbed it, her hands shaking, and hurled it at the man in the front. It missed, shattering against the wall behind him. But it distracted him, and that was enough. She darted past him, ignoring the pain in her legs, and lunged for the hallway. The first figure reached for her arm, but she twisted out of his grasp, her body slick with sweat and fear. She was running. The hallway stretched out in front of her, endless. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her legs pumping faster, but she could hear them behind her. Footsteps closing in, getting closer. She rounded a corner, heart in her throat, looking for another way out. Then there it was, a small door at the end of the hall. A way out. She didn't stop to think. She didn't hesitate. She threw herself against it, shoving it open with all her strength. But as the door cracked, the sound of a voice stopped her cold. "You really think you're going to escape?" It was the man's voice again, but this time it was more mocking, more sinister. She couldn't stop. She didn't have time to think. She shoved through the door, stepping into another dark room. Her mind was blank, but her body kept moving, driven by pure instinct. She had to escape. She had to survive. And in that moment, with the darkness closing in behind her, she realized she might be running for her life. But she would fight until the end. Her breath was ragged, her chest heaving as she sprinted through the dark room, her feet pounding against the cold, hard floor. She could hear them, footsteps, whispers, the unmistakable sound of pursuit closing in. Her mind was a blur, her thoughts scattered as she fought to stay ahead, to escape, to survive. She didn't know where she was. She didn't know what was on the other side of the door she had just bolted through. But she couldn't stop. The hallway stretched endlessly in front of her, lit only by a faint, flickering light from an overhead bulb. There was no time to think, no time to question. Her heart thundered in her ears, louder than the sound of her own footsteps. The walls seemed to close in around her, the claustrophobic space pressing against her, the air thick with the smell of dust and mildew. She couldn't keep running forever. She had to find a way out. Her eyes scanned the space, frantically searching for something, anything that might offer a chance of escape. And then she saw it. A narrow door at the far end of the hall, half hidden by shadows. Her pulse quickened. It was her only option. She ran toward it, her legs screaming in protest, but she didn't care. Her fingers brushed the cold metal handle as she reached the door, her hand shaking with desperation. The door creaked open, and she pushed through, barely registering what lay beyond. It was a stairwell, leading down into an even darker, quieter space. She hesitated for a split second, hearing the sound of footsteps growing closer. There was no time to waste. She plunged down the stairs, one step at a time, each footfall echoing loudly in the silence, each movement heavy with fear. She didn't know where the stairs would lead. She didn't care. All that mattered was getting away. The cold air hit her as she reached the bottom, the dampness of the basement surrounding her. But she barely noticed. Her thoughts were a jumbled mess, her body fueled by sheer panic. A single, dim light bulb hung overhead, casting long, eerie shadows along the walls. But she wasn't thinking about the darkness. She was thinking about the way out. There was no way she was going back up those stairs, not without a fight. She scanned the room again, looking for anything she could use to defend herself. Nothing. The sound of the footsteps was louder now, closer. She wasn't alone anymore. Suddenly, a hand shot out of the shadows, grabbing her wrist, pulling her back with a brutal force. Her scream was silenced almost immediately as another hand clamped over her mouth. "You thought you could run." The man's voice was low, cruel. And as she struggled in his grip, the world around her began to fade. There was no escape. Not anymore. The second the realization hit her, everything seemed to slow, the chaos fading into a sharp, suffocating silence. Her heart raced in her chest as she struggled against the man's grip, her body fighting for freedom, but his hold was too strong. She twisted, desperate, her breath muffled under his hand, but it only fueled the panic rising within her. There was no way out, no escape. The sound of her pulse drummed in her ears as she fought for air, but the man's grip didn't loosen. For a moment, time seemed to stretch, every second dragging painfully. Then, suddenly, the pressure around her wrist released. She gasped for breath, her body trembling from the rush of adrenaline. It was then she heard it, the unmistakable sound of a door slamming open, followed by a loud voice. "Let her go!" The man's hold faltered, just for a moment. The girl turned toward the sound of the voice, blinking through the haze of fear. It was him, the man who had helped her earlier. His face was stern, his eyes locked on the man holding her, his posture commanding and steady. "Stay back," the man growled, his voice low and threatening. But the man didn't move, his gaze unwavering. "Now," he repeated, more forceful this time, his voice carrying an edge of authority. "Let her go. You don't want to do this." For a moment, the two men locked eyes, a silent, tense standoff filling the room. Then, with a sharp exhale, the man released her, shoving her away as if she were nothing more than an inconvenience. She stumbled back, her legs unsteady, but she didn't fall. The moment she was free, she ran toward him, toward safety. The man didn't hesitate. He reached out, grabbing her arm and pulling her close, guiding her toward the exit. "Come on," he urged, urgency in his voice. She didn't need to be told twice. She followed him without question, her heart still hammering in her chest. But now there was a sliver of hope. They reached the door, and as they stepped outside into the cold night air, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The world felt different out here, as though she had crossed into another life. But even as they ran, the girl knew one thing with certainty. She wasn't alone anymore. And for the first time in days, that thought, simple and pure, was enough to keep her going. They disappeared into the night, leaving the darkness behind.